Homers, walks, strikeouts. Baseball's three true outcomes are realities, but we know reality isn't a linear path. It's a prism, and those endless possibilities in the diamond, well, they get you thinking. This is a what-if edition of Battery Power. Cory McCartney along with Grant McAuley. And while I play the role of the watcher, we put this thought exercise onto you, Braves country. What if the big three never broke up? Glavine, Maddux, and Smoltz wrote Hall of Fame legacies together, but each had their final chapter away from Atlanta. And we're here to explore how different things could have been had they stayed together as Braves.
I think it could have been very different. And they spent so much time together that you were thinking for a while in the 90s that this was the reality of the Atlanta Braves. And Glavine, Maddux, Smoltz, Smoltz, Maddux, Glavine, Maddux, Smoltz, Glavine, whatever order you put them in, you could not go wrong. But it seemed like right around the turn of the century and the new millennium, it was over with a snap of the fingers. And it really kind of was, or maybe with a stroke of the pen in the case of a couple of them. And it was a very big change for Braves fans from the reality they had come to know of the club that had been to the World Series 5 times in the 1990s, won it, of course, in 1995, and been built on pitching all the while. While some of the offensive faces changed and changed quite often, it was always the consistency of the rotation that was the hallmark of the Atlanta Braves in the 1990s. So as a kid who grew up watching that 80s club go from having some young and potential up-and-comers who turned themselves into Cy Young Award winners, to signing a big free agent after the 1992 season that really, I think, cemented the fortunes of this club in the 1990s. It was a fun ride, but that ride did end in the early 2000s, Cory, and there were certainly reasons for which we will discuss on this episode of What If.
Yeah, I think it's important that before we look at the alternate reality, we explore how we even got through the one that we actually ended up living through. Glavine leaves after the 2002 season, joining the Mets on a 3-year, $35 million deal with an option for a 4th year. The Braves had asked him to defer money. Some frustration surfaced on both sides, and Glavine ultimately ends up leaving. And then Maddux bolts a year later, rejoining the Cubs on a 3-year deal with the Braves looking to cut costs, and Smoltz stuck it out through 2008, a season that would end with shoulder injury for him. He played his final games with the Cardinals in 2009, had a stint with the Red Sox as well that year. Had they stayed together, though, I mean, some really tantalizing possibilities of what could have meant in reversing fortunes in the regular season, reversing fortunes in the postseason. But Grant, also some milestones along the way that a couple of these guys especially would have had happen in Braves uniforms.
I mean, the Braves were set up, I think, to watch some of these great milestones happen for these pitchers that were so integral to their success in the 1990s. We saw Cy Young Awards. We saw strikeout titles. We saw wins titles, ERA titles, pretty much any accolade that a pitcher could get. Gold Gloves, Silver Sluggers, all the things that it could be, right down to getting their own commercial where chicks dig the long ball, which perhaps they still do. Who am I to say that they don't? But there were those milestones that you get to at the end of your career, the kind of milestones we're not going to see quite as often these days. And 2 of them being Tom Glavine and Greg Maddux in different uniforms in Atlanta, winning their 300th game. For Maddux, his 3,000 strikeout came in a Cubs uniform, as did his 300th win. For Glavine, it was 300 wins as a member of the New York Mets. That wasn't quite the same. Now, the one constant for the Braves throughout this, of course, was John Smoltz, who did not leave until that final season, where I feel like he felt he had something left in the tank. He wanted to go find out. And that chapter wasn't one that Braves fans probably think of all too often. 200 wins in a Braves uniform, 150 saves in a Braves uniform, only pitcher ever to do that. And 3,000 strikeouts came for John Smoltz in his final season with the Braves, though it was cut short by injury. There were those milestones out there, and I've often thought, just as a baseball historian, if you want to call me that, or just somebody who enjoys the nostalgia that comes with milestone victories and the team that you grow up watching, it would have been nice to see Tom Glavine win game number 300 with the Braves. Same thing for Greg Maddux, but maybe a little different for Glavine because he did, in fact, get drafted, get developed, come up with the Braves, become a Cy Young Award winner, a multi-time All-Star, and that piece of his legacy was written as a member of the Mets. That might be a little more off-putting than really for Greg Maddux, who was able to bookend his time with the Cubs, where he picked up his first win. He was back there to pick up his 300th win, his 3,000 strikeout in the same uniform. He picked up his very first strikeout. There's something poetic about that for Maddux. For Glavine, though, it doesn't quite feel the same. And I'm not even going to get into John Smoltz, Boston Red Sox, or St. Louis Cardinals, because that it kind of hurts your heart a little bit to see that after him spending 2 decades in the Braves organization.
When I consider what might have been, it really comes down to me, 2005 and 2006. In 2005, that was the year in which Smoltz made his return to the rotation, was sensational that year. If you go off Fangraphs WAR, was a 5.2 WAR pitcher that year. Glavine had a 3.7 WAR, the best of any of his Mets seasons, and Maddux was a 3.3 WAR pitcher. Smoltz was the only member of the Braves staff that year that had a better WAR than Glavine or Maddux would have had they all been together. And in that year's NLDS, the Braves allowed 10 runs to the Astros in a game started by Tim Hudson, 7 and one started by Jorge Sosa, and 7 and one started by Joey Glavine. That against a Houston team that would end up going to the World Series. And you have to think, had you had those guys in Glavine and Maddux performing at that level with that group, and Smoltz at that pitching at that height, you have to think things might have gone a little bit different that year. And obviously a year later, 2006, is when you had the division title streak end. And Atlanta finished 18 games behind the Mets and Tom Glavine that year. Smoltz had a 5.5 WAR that year. Maddux had his best season post-Braves at 4.3 WAR. Glavine was at 2.9. Add in Hudson at 2.5. And that team, I mean, they may not have been sitting home for the playoffs that year. And the Braves were dangerous to the plate. I mean, don't forget, they ranked 5th in runs that year, 2nd in homers. They allowed the 6th most home runs in the National League, the 6th most. You got to tell me, if you have Glavine, Maddux, and Smoltz together in that rotation, along with the way Hudson was pitching, that they're going to give up that many home runs. I just think those 2 years in particular, you can look at all the stuff that happened after they left, and however you want to boil it down, I think those 2 years are the ones that I really wonder what could have been had they stayed together.
Yeah, well, thinking a little bit about Glavine leaving after his 2002 season, this was to me the first signal that the Braves were in a very different place than they had been in the 1990s when they were under the ownership of Ted Turner proper. And that change right there, I think, was just a little bit of a harbinger of things to come when it came to no longer being the highest payroll in baseball, or one of them, which the Braves very much were throughout the 90s and into the turn of the millennium. Those kind of things started to change. So I think that it was forcing John Schuerholz to rethink the equation in a way that he quite simply had not had to do before. And he was up to the challenge for the most part, of being able to cobble together rotations that were good enough to get the Braves into the postseason again in 2003. Of course, that was an offensively driven year. 2004, they had to be creative again. And that's a trade, a great what if we could talk about if Adam Wainwright had not been traded for J.D. Drew. Do the Braves win the division in 2004? I highly doubt it. I think J.D. Drew was their best player that year, or at least very much one of them. If you want to throw Chipper Jones and Andrew Jones into that mix, it was a very short list. There weren't quite as many top performers on that team, forgetting about the loss of Greg Maddux after 2003 and the fact that John Smoltz was still in the bullpen and closing games at that time. So it was a very different landscape for the Braves way back then. And in 2005, it was the year of those baby Braves. It was a very unexpected division title, a little bit different than the unexpected division title of 2004. But I'm with you, Corey. I do agree that having Greg Maddux, having Tom Glavine, even as they had kind of turned into middle of the rotation or innings eater style pitchers, they still had more than enough gas in the tank to get you through the regular season. I think they could have made a difference in the playoffs. And whether we're talking about the Jorge Sosas, even the Tim Hudsons, or the game that wasn't started by Joey Glavine, but ended with that Chris Burke walk-off home run, Tim Hudson started that game. And that was another night in which the Braves saw make that 7 runs on the board by the time it was over in 18 innings. It was agonizing. And you didn't often say that the games started by Glavine, Maddux, or Smoltz were in any way, shape, or form agonizing. And that, I think, would have gone a long way towards making Braves fans feel perhaps a little bit more comfortable with those guys they had come to know so well, even as they aged, even if they weren't the ERA title, the strikeout title, the Cy Young Award winner multiple times over, and between the 3 of them, quite a few times over, the likes of which I don't know if you can ever assemble a rotation like that again. But I did go back and look. What would it have cost for the Braves to keep together Glavine, Maddux, and Smoltz from that 2002 offseason where Tom Glavine decided to become a New York Met, moving all the way through 2008? And I'm also going to throw in there this other what if. What if John Smoltz had simply retired after 2008 because his buddies had been there all the while? The 3 of them were together that whole time. it would have cost the Braves roughly $150 million in payroll to keep all three of them together. And the only one who was still performing like an ace for the most part of that time was John Smoltz. But in 2002, 3, 4, he was a closer. And that sounds like crazy money to keep three guys together for 5 years. And maybe it is. And what are the ripple effects, Corey? What would that money under the new ownership and the AOL Time Warner period of the Braves, what would that have meant that Atlanta would have to do? Would they have never traded for Tim Hudson? Would they have never been able to hold on to an Andrew Jones or a Chipper Jones for as long as they did, because they had to cut money somewhere and maybe trade a 27, 28-year-old Andrew Jones? Maybe Chipper Jones is forced to rethink his whole stance on free agency, which he never did really rethink. In fact, he's famous for taking less money. But those are the what ifs that came to me after thinking about this in long form. So I hope all of that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you want to look at it from production standpoint. If you look and see and add them, into what they actually had, what could have played out. But certainly, there's the realities of the financial end of it. And certainly, I mean, who knows if Hudson does end up in Atlanta, if that happens. And as you mentioned, there's all these ripple effects. But we know that together, apart, regardless of how their stories ended, they all ended in Cooperstown. And so, yes, however you want to talk about how this thing played out for the franchise, you just wonder. I mean, are we still talking about a championship between 95 and 2021 if they're together? I mean, obviously, 150 million, you said, to have kept them together, but what would that have been worth to have delivered another championship in between those seasons? I think at a minimum, you're talking about a division title streak that went on a little bit longer, but certainly there's the possibility of what if they could have delivered another championship to this team.
That what if is the great what if that Braves fans find themselves asking just throughout the 90s, when we were talking about all of these guys at the very peak of their powers. And I don't look at the 90s and think that, hey, that big trio of Tom Glavine, Greg Maddux, and John Smoltz, in whatever order, did not deliver on the promise they showed during the regular season. Maddux may not have the record in the postseason, but more times than not, he looked like Greg Maddux. And the same is true for Tom Glavine. Maybe it changed toward the end of his tenure with the Braves, but it certainly was on display in the mid-90s when he gave Atlanta the best pitching performance of his career in the biggest game, and a one we were still talking about as perhaps the greatest postseason game for the Braves until they were able to win another World Series this year. Now maybe it's fair to at least open up the field and talk about all the great World Series performances, given that we have a few more to discuss, including Max Fried in the clinching game here in 2021. I don't want to let recency bias overtake this podcast, because the lefty I think that made the most indelible mark on the Atlanta Braves was, in fact, Tom Glavine. And I'm glad he's back around the club now. I'm glad he got to come home, even though he was not the pitcher he wanted to be. An injury obviously curtailed his curtain call with the Braves. It was nice to see him back in a Braves uniform to end it. But it was coming at about the time that not too long after that, John Smoltz was headed out of the organization to end his career elsewhere. But the ripple effects are fascinating. If Greg Maddux had stayed, would the Braves have had to trade Kevin Millwood? The answer was yes. In 2003, Kevin Millwood was traded away. How would he have performed in Atlanta? Again, would Tim Hudson have ever been traded to the Braves? Would the Braves have ever made that Mike Hampton trade, which was very creative, even if he ended up injured for a good portion of his time with the Braves as well? Those are kind of things that I wonder. Just what would this rotation have looked like, but also what kind of effects would it have had on keeping Chipper Jones, on keeping Andrew Jones, at least for the majority of his career and maybe in some of his prime years? Could you imagine Andrew hitting his 50 home runs somewhere else in 2005? What if that had been the cost of keeping Greg Maddux, or re-signing Tom Glavine, or extending John Smoltz during that period of time? It's fair to ask what kind of gymnastics that John Schuerholz would have been having to do financially in order to do it. And I think at the time, he made the best decisions he could. He let the older players go. He held on to the one that he felt, I think, the strongest about, and the one that performed the best for him. If he had to pick one of the three from that point forward, I do think it was John Smoltz. From the year 2002 or 3 through the close of his career, he was simply more dominant.
Well, the one undeniable thing here is there is power in those words, what if. We'll be back for more of these Braves reality twisting journeys. And if you want to see one in particular, put it in the comments section. We'd love to hear what you guys want to hear as we continue this What If series throughout the off season. So obviously so much more to come from us here on Battery Power. So make sure you subscribe to the Talking Chop YouTube channel. Make sure you hit subscribe, turn on those notifications so you get an alert every time that we drop a new episode of Battery Power. I'm Cory McCartney. He's Grant McAuley. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in next time, Braves Country.